What does it take for a man to vanish without a trace? In the Appalachian Mountains, the wilderness keeps its secrets well. For 2 years, Richard Miller's name was just another line in a growing list of people swallowed up by these ancient ridges. Another hunter who walked into the trees and never returned. But the truth, when it finally surfaced, was darker than anyone expected. It waited underground, tangled in the roots of a giant oak tree, until a storm tore it free. November 6th, 2021. Richard was 41 years old, married, with 2 children. This was not a man prone to foolish mistakes. Born and raised in West Virginia, the forest was in his blood. He didn't just know the mountains, he understood them. To him, hunting was not a sport. It was a discipline, a way of reading the land, respecting its dangers, and knowing how to survive them. Every fall, Richard disappeared into the mountains for a few days of solitude. It was his ritual, time to recharge, to be alone with the wind and the earth. His wife, Susan, never worried much. Richard was meticulous about safety. Before each trip, he'd unfold a map across the kitchen table, pointing out his exact route, marking planned stops, and estimating his return time. His rule was simple. If I haven't been in touch by Monday evening, start calling on Tuesday morning. This time, everything followed the script. Richard's destination was the Spruce Knob Ridge area, straddling the state line, a wild stretch he knew by heart. His goal, an old, abandoned observation tower near the North Fork Mountain Trail. He packed light, a backpack with 3 days of supplies, his rifle, and a weathered GPS navigator he trusted more than any phone. He kissed Susan goodbye, promised to be back on Monday, and drove off in his pickup. No one ever saw him alive again. Monday night came and went. Susan felt a faint unease, but told herself it was nothing. Bad weather, maybe, or Richard taking a night in the truck before driving home. But by Tuesday morning, with no signal and no word, her calm collapsed into panic. She called the county sheriff's office. They reassured her. These things happen, they said, and promised to send a patrol to the trailhead. Hours later, they called back. Richard's truck was there, parked neatly. No sign of forced entry, no struggle. Everything inside was in place. That was both reassuring and terrifying. If the truck was untouched, Richard had gone into the woods on foot and never returned. 4 days had passed since he left. On Wednesday, the search began in earnest. The sheriff's deputies were joined by state rescue teams, dog handlers, and volunteers. Many of them hunters like Richard, people who knew every hollow and ridge. The first days carried a cautious optimism. The most logical theory was simple. He'd slipped, fallen, maybe broken a leg. He could be alive, waiting for rescue. Teams swept the area in careful sectors, shouting his name. Dogs caught his scent from the truck, but lost it just a few hundred yards up the trail, where rock replaced soil. A helicopter scanned from above, but the autumn canopy was a dense, shifting quilt of reds and golds, impenetrable from the air. Days passed. Nothing. No dropped gear, no torn fabric, no trace of human passage. Rescuers retraced his intended route over and over, especially toward the tower. They scoured every stream and ravine. Still, there was nothing. Theories began to crumble. Richard was too experienced to just vanish. Even if tragedy struck, there should have been clues. A backpack, a rifle, a bear attack. Unlikely. Bears here were rare aggressors, and such an encounter would have left signs. Blood, shredded cloth, tracks in the mud. There was nothing. It was as though he had stepped off the trail and been erased. Among the volunteers, the talk grew darker. Old-timers recalled local legends, stories of those who walked into these mountains and never came back. The professionals kept to the facts. But for almost 2 weeks, there were no facts at all. Then, just as the search was about to be called off, a group of volunteers made a discovery. About 3 miles from where Richard's camp should have been, they found the remnants of a small fire. It sat in a hollow, hidden from the main trail. The ashes told their own story. No older than a week, maybe a week and a half. Nearby, something metallic caught the eye of a searcher. 2 spent shell casings, their brass dulled but unmistakable. The caliber matched Richard's rifle. At last, proof he'd been here. But answers gave way to more questions. Why was he so far off his planned route? Why the detour? And why had he fired his weapon? If it was for hunting, where was the kill? If it was a signal for help, why only 2 shots? Searchers swept the area inch by inch, no signs of a struggle, no blood. The dogs were brought in again, and again they faltered, circling, sniffing, but unable to follow any trail away from the site. Stranger still, none of Richard's gear was there. No backpack, no tent, no sleeping bag, no rifle. A man alone in the mountains doesn't abandon his equipment without reason. For several more days, the search widened around the campfire site. Nothing turned up. Then came the first snow, and with it, the cold reality that the active search had to end. Richard Miller's case was classified as missing under unclear circumstances. For his family, that was the worst possible fate. There was no grave to visit, no ceremony to bring closure, and no concrete answers to explain his absence. There was only an empty chair at the dinner table, a silent phone, and a question that would not go away. What happened at that lonely campfire deep in the Appalachian woods? 1 year passed, then another. Richard's name slipped from the headlines and settled into local folklore. In diners and on front porches, people spoke of him as one more victim of the mountains, a man who stepped into the forest and never returned. Most had quietly accepted the idea that there would never be an answer. Then came the spring of 2023. For 7 straight days, torrential rains pounded the Appalachians. Streams swelled into rushing torrents, chewing away at their banks. Hillsides collapsed under the weight of water, sliding in the dark sheets of mud. Nature, which had guarded its secret for so long, seemed ready to reveal it. A group of hikers set out along one of the lesser-known trails in the Spruce Knob area. Their path followed a low stretch of ground, tracing the route of an old dry stream bed. The rain had softened the earth and reshaped the terrain. That was when they saw it. A massive red oak, likely hundreds of years old, lay toppled on its side. Its fall was recent. The air was still heavy with the scent of damp soil and freshly split wood. The tree's root system rose like a tangled wall of thick ropes, still clinging to slabs of rock and clumps of wet earth. The hikers paused to take photographs. One man stepped closer, scanning the exposed roots, and then he froze. At first, the others did not understand what he was looking at. Then they saw it too. A patch of faded blue fabric pressed into the soil beneath the thickest root. Nearby, half buried in the churned ground, was something that looked like a strap or a belt. It was not the kind of debris one expected to find in a stream bed. Something about it felt wrong. One of the hikers pulled out a phone and called 911. A patrol officer arrived quickly. One look was all it took to realize this was no false alarm. The area was cordoned off, and detectives from the sheriff's office were called to the scene. News traveled quickly. The investigator who had worked on Richard Miller's case 2 years earlier was preparing to leave for the day when the call came in. The location. The proximity to Richard's last known route. He got in his car and drove straight to Spruce Knob. Recovering what lay beneath the roots was painstaking. The forensic team worked with the caution of archaeologists, aware that the mass of wood and earth above them could shift at any moment. Using small shovels and brushes, they uncovered the first item, the corner of a partially decomposed backpack. Next came the remains of a thick hunting jacket, its fabric stiff and darkened by years underground, and a rotted leather belt that crumbled at the edges. Finally, they reached bone. A human skeleton lay in a cramped, unnatural position, curled slightly on its side. It looked as if it had been placed into the hollow beneath the roots when the tree was still alive. Small roots had woven themselves through the ribs and limbs, binding the remains to the earth. When the skull was uncovered, the mystery of Richard's disappearance became clearer. A deep dent marked the temporal bone, a wound made by a heavy, blunt object with enormous force. This was no accident, no falling branch, no random blow. It was deliberate. As the recovery continued, one investigator searched the exposed root system. 4 feet from the body, buried partway into the hardwood, was the handle of a hunting knife. The blade had been driven so far into the wood that it could not be pulled free by hand. It did not look like a discarded tool. It looked like a statement. The remains and the recovered items were sent to the forensic lab. Dental records confirmed what everyone already suspected. The skeleton was Richard Miller. After 2 years of uncertainty, his family finally had an answer, but it was an answer that brought no comfort. The autopsy confirmed what the investigators had already begun to suspect. The wound to Richard's skull could not have been caused by a fall. The position of the body and the way the roots had grown around it showed that he was already dead when he was placed beneath the oak. At that time, the tree had been alive and healthy. Someone had deliberately dug or widened a cavity under the roots, hidden the body inside, and packed the earth tightly around it. The forest had kept the secret until heavy rains brought it to light. Now the disappearance was officially classified as a homicide. But who had killed Richard Miller? The clue came from the decayed backpack. Most of its contents were destroyed by time and moisture, but the thick synthetic straps had been shielded well enough to preserve something remarkable. Forensic scientists found DNA. It was not Richard's. The DNA was a complete male profile. Investigators uploaded it into CODIS, the National DNA Database, in hopes of finding a match. A few hours later, the answer came back. There was a match. The DNA recovered from Richard Miller's backpack belonged to a man named Johnny Barrett. Detectives pulled up his file. He was 49 years old, a local resident without steady work. His name was already familiar to wildlife inspectors throughout the state. Barrett had a long history of arrests for poaching, illegal trapping, and carrying weapons in restricted areas. He was a man of the woods, but one who lived by his own rules, not the laws of nature or the state. People described him as a shadow gliding along the trails, rarely seen, but known to all. The most important detail emerged when detectives checked his criminal record for November of 2021. Only a few days after Richard Miller vanished, Barrett had been arrested by a patrol in the southern part of the state, more than 100 miles from Spruce Knob. He had been caught red-handed, hunting deer illegally. He was in the woods, he was armed, and this was during the exact days when hundreds of volunteers were combing the mountains in search of Richard. That could not be dismissed as coincidence. Detectives began re-examining reports from the original investigation, interviewing those who had been involved in the search. That was when they found something. One of the gamekeepers recalled a brief encounter during the active phase of the search. He had met Barrett on a rural road. He had asked if Barrett had seen a man matching Richard's description. Barrett seemed nervous, but admitted he had seen a hunter walking along the North Fork Trail. He claimed they nodded at each other and went their separate ways. Back in 2021, no one thought much of it. Encounters between hunters were common, but now Richard had been found dead, and Barrett's DNA was on his backpack. That story no longer sounded harmless. It sounded like a lie. Something had happened between the two men out there on that trail. The search for a missing man was over. The hunt for a killer had begun. With a warrant and irrefutable forensic evidence, detectives moved to locate Johnny Barrett. It was not easy. Barrett had no permanent address. He drifted between the homes of distant relatives, cheap motels on the edges of small towns, and temporary camps hidden deep in the forest. He knew how to cover his tracks and avoid attention. Detectives spent several days questioning his few acquaintances and family members. Most claimed they had not seen him in months. Whether that was the truth or an attempt to protect him was unclear. Then an anonymous tip came in. Barrett was reportedly hiding in an abandoned trailer on the edge of a logging site in a neighboring county. At dawn, 2 police vehicles pulled up to the property without sirens. The trailer looked empty, its windows clouded with dust, but a thin wisp of smoke curled from a metal stovepipe. Detectives took positions and called out over a megaphone that the trailer was surrounded. After a moment, the door creaked open. Johnny Barrett stepped out. He was unarmed. His face looked tired and resigned, as if he had been expecting this moment. He offered no resistance as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. The interrogation room was small and bare. Barrett sat with his hands clasped on the table, staring at a point on the wall. For the first 2 hours, he repeated the same line. "I don't know anything. I don't understand what you're talking about. I didn't touch him." He stuck to the story he had told the gamekeeper 2 years earlier. He said he had seen Richard on the trail, they had passed each other, and that was the end of it. His voice was steady, almost indifferent. The detectives listened without interruption. Then one of them placed a photograph on the table. It showed Richard Miller's decayed backpack lying on a lab table. "We found his things, Johnny. the detective said evenly. Barrett glanced at the photo and shrugged. So what? I didn't touch it. The detective then slid another document forward. It was a crime lab report with a paragraph highlighted. The problem is, Johnny, we found your DNA on that backpack, not just a trace, a complete profile. It was on the strap. You held that backpack in your hands. Now, explain how that happened if you just went your separate ways. For the first time, Barrett's expression changed. The defiance in his eyes gave way to something heavier. He realized he had been caught. The detectives pressed on. They described the discovery beneath the oak tree, the position of the skeleton, and the fatal dent in the skull. They spoke of the 2 years Richard's family had spent in uncertainty. Their tone stayed measured and cold. He didn't just disappear, Johnny. He was murdered. He was beaten to death and hidden like garbage. And you were the last person to see him. Your fingerprints are everywhere. This is your last chance to tell us what happened. Barrett stared at the table for a long time. Then he sighed. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and strained. He admitted his original story was a lie. They had not simply nodded and walked away. That day, he had been tracking a deer in a no-hunting zone. He was close to his target when he stumbled upon Richard Miller. Richard immediately recognized Barrett for what he was, a poacher. He could see the absence of permits, the way Barrett carried himself, and the illegal nature of his hunt. Richard, a man who followed the rules, spoke up. He told Barrett that people like him disgraced all honest hunters. He said he would report him to the gamekeepers without hesitation. The words cut deep and tempers flared. Barrett claimed that Richard threatened to take his rifle. Voices rose, each man unwilling to back down. The heated exchange turned into a physical scuffle. Barrett insisted that Richard had grabbed his backpack in an attempt to stop him. In Barrett's version of events, panic and rage collided. He pushed Richard away, trying to break free. Then, according to him, something in his mind snapped. He claimed the moment went dark. He reached for something heavy from the ground. He was not sure if it was a rock or a thick branch, and struck Richard once. He said he had not intended to kill him, only to make him back off. But the damage was done. When Richard collapsed and stopped breathing, Barrett froze. The reality of the situation hit him hard. This was no longer about illegal hunting. This was now murder. He dragged the body off the trail and deeper into the forest, wandering for hours in a haze of fear and confusion. Eventually, he came across a giant oak tree. Beneath its sprawling roots was a hollow. To Barrett, it looked like a chance to make the body disappear. He spent more than an hour forcing Richard's body into the hollow and covering it with soil and rocks until there was no trace left. He took Richard's backpack and rifle, intending to create the illusion that Richard had left the area and gotten lost. The rifle was later dismantled and dumped in a swamp far from Spruce Knob. The backpack was burned. When asked about the hunting knife embedded deep in the oak's roots, Barrett refused to answer. He simply shook his head, his eyes fixed on the table. Whether he did not remember or simply did not want to talk about it was unclear. This was not the heartfelt confession of a man seeking forgiveness. It was the calculated account of someone caught in a corner, trying to shape the story in his favor. He placed himself at the scene. He admitted to striking Richard and hiding his body. Based on this admission and the physical evidence, Johnny Barrett was charged with second-degree murder. He was placed in the county jail to await his first court appearance. For Richard Miller's family, justice finally seemed within reach after 2 long years of unanswered questions. But the trial never happened. 3 weeks after his arrest, during morning rounds, a guard found Barrett lying motionless in his cell. Paramedics confirmed his death from a massive heart attack. Richard Miller's killer had been named, but never convicted. The case was officially closed. The forensic findings confirmed what investigators already knew. Richard had died from a single powerful blow to the head with a blunt object, and his body had been hidden under the roots of a living tree. The motive, a sudden eruption of anger during a confrontation in the wilderness, died with Johnny Barrett in his cell.